I'm 25 now, and I run acquisitions for a commercial property group that handles foreclosures and distressed assets across 3 states. My office has floor-to-ceiling windows, and my door has my name on it in brushed steel letters. 6 years ago, I was sleeping on a cot in county jail, wondering if my entire family had collectively lost their minds or if I was the one going crazy. Turns out it was option 3. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they did it anyway because Roy was always supposed to be the son they wanted, and I was just in the way. Let me back up because this sounds insane, and I know it, but I promise you every word of this happened, and I've spent 6 years making sure I'd never forget a single detail. I was 19 in the summer of 2019 and still living at home because I was working full-time at a warehouse and saving money for a place of my own. My parents, Frank and Simone, ran a small commercial cleaning operation, and they'd always made it clear I was supposed to join the family business eventually, but I wanted to do something different. That alone was apparently a problem because Frank would make these comments about how I thought I was too good for honest work, and Simone would do this thing where she'd sigh really loudly whenever I talked about my plans, like I was exhausting her just by existing. Roy was my cousin on Frank's side, and he'd moved to our city about 8 months before everything went down. He was 21 and supposedly taking business classes at the community college, but mostly he was charming and good-looking and knew exactly what to say to make my parents think he was this ambitious go-getter. He'd show up at family dinners with ideas about expanding the cleaning business, and Frank would actually listen to him while he'd shut me down if I suggested anything. Simone loved that Roy complimented her cooking and asked about her day and basically acted like the perfect son they'd apparently always wanted, instead of the one they got stuck with. The thing is, I didn't even hate Roy at first. I thought he was kind of trying too hard, but whatever. He was family, and my parents clearly preferred him, so I just stayed out of the way and focused on my job and saving money. I had this 2006 Toyota Camry that I'd bought myself, and I was proud of it because it was mine, and I'd earned it. My bedroom was in the basement, and I kept to myself most evenings because the vibe upstairs was always tense whenever I was around. Then in July, my parents told me Roy was moving in with us because his landlord sold the building or something, and he needed a temporary place. I said fine, but I'm not sharing my room. And Frank actually laughed and said Roy would take the guest room upstairs, obviously. Except 2 weeks later, Simone came downstairs and said she needed my room for storage, and I should move my stuff to the guest room because Roy needed the basement for privacy while he studied. I was pissed, but I moved my things because fighting with them was exhausting, and I figured I'd be out of there in a few months anyway. That's when I started noticing my car keys would be missing in the mornings, and Roy would show up at dinner talking about errands he ran that day, and Frank would nod along like it was totally normal that Roy was using my car without asking. I confronted Roy about it once, and he said he thought it was the family car and got all apologetic, but then he kept doing it. When I told Frank, he said I was being selfish and Roy needed transportation to get to class and his job interviews, and I should be more supportive of family. August 19th, 2019. I'll never forget that date because that's the night they burned my entire life down and smiled while doing it. Frank told me that morning we were all going to the mall that evening because Simone wanted to shop for Haley's birthday present and it would be good for the family to spend time together. I said I had a shift at the warehouse, but Frank said I should skip it just this once, and I was stupid enough to think maybe they actually wanted me around for something. We got to the mall around 7 p.m. It was a Thursday, and the place was busy. We walked around for maybe 20 minutes, and then Roy said something to Frank that I didn't catch, and Frank nodded. We were near the food court, and suddenly Roy just turned and shoved me hard. I stumbled backward, and he shoved me again and started yelling that I'd been talking trash about him to his girlfriend, and I needed to learn some respect. I was completely confused because I barely spoke to Roy, let alone his girlfriend, and I told him to back off. He swung at me. I ducked, and he connected with my shoulder, and then he came at me again, and I shoved him back because what else was I supposed to do? We were both yelling, and people were staring and pulling out phones, and then Roy threw a punch that hit me in the jaw, and I reacted and shoved him hard enough that he fell backward into a table. That's when mall security showed up. Here's where it gets really sick. The security guards grabbed both of us and were pulling us apart and asking what happened. And Roy immediately started saying I attacked him out of nowhere and I was unstable and dangerous. I tried to explain, but then Simone started screaming. Actually screaming. She was pointing at me and telling the guards that's not our son. That's a monster. Get him away from us. I thought she was having some kind of breakdown because why would she say that? But then Frank walked right up to the head of security and said very calmly that they needed to ban me from the property because I was violent and had been threatening Roy for weeks and they were scared for their safety. I just stood there. I couldn't process what was happening. Haley was filming on her phone and smiling. Actually, smiling. The security guards were looking at me like I was some kind of criminal and Roy was holding his arm like I'd broken it. even though I'd barely touched him and my parents were backing away from me like I was about to attack them too. They threw me out. The guards literally escorted me to the parking lot and told me I was banned from the mall. And if I came back, they'd call the police. I was standing in the parking lot trying to understand what just happened when the police actually showed up. Someone had called them. Roy pressed charges for assault. My parents gave statements saying I'd attacked him unprovoked and they were worried I might hurt someone else. I got arrested that night. They held me for 3 days before my bail hearing and set bail at $5,000, which I couldn't pay. So I sat in county waiting for trial. My court-appointed attorney was handling about 60 cases and barely looked at my file. The security footage from the mall supposedly showed me as the aggressor because Roy had positioned us perfectly before he shoved me, and the angle made it look like I started it. My parents testified against me, both of them. Simone cried on the stand and said she didn't recognize her own son anymore, and Frank said I'd been increasingly violent and angry for months. I took a plea deal, 7 months in county jail. My attorney said if I went to trial, I could get years because the prosecutor was pushing for felony assault, and with my parents' testimony, I'd lose. So I plead guilty to simple assault and got 7 months, and they told me I was lucky. I found out later through a friend who still talked to Haley that Roy moved into my basement bedroom the day after I got arrested. He was driving my Camry to his new job at Frank's cleaning company. Simone had redecorated my room and bought Roy new furniture. They told everyone in the family that I'd had a psychotic break and attacked Roy, and they'd had to make the difficult decision to press charges for everyone's safety. When I got out in March 2020, I took the bus to the house and my key didn't work. They'd changed the locks. I knocked and Frank opened the door about 6 inches and said I wasn't welcome there anymore and I needed to leave. I asked for my stuff and he said they'd donated my belongings because they assumed I wouldn't want them after what I'd done. My car was gone. My clothes, my laptop, everything. Gone. Simone appeared behind Frank and said they'd prayed about this and decided that for the safety of their family, including Roy, who they now consider their real son, I couldn't have contact with any of them anymore. Real son. Those words. I asked about Haley and Simone said Haley agreed with their decision. Then Frank shut the door. I stood on that porch for maybe 5 minutes. Then I walked away. I had $200 in my jail account that they'd given me when I was released, and the clothes on my back. That's it. That was my life after 19 years. 2 days later, Haley texted me a video. It was dated the night I got sentenced. My parents and Roy and Haley were in the dining room with wine glasses raised, and Frank was saying, "Here's to new beginnings," and Simone was laughing, and Roy had his arm around her shoulder like he actually was her son. The caption Haley sent said, "Thought you should know we're doing great without you." I could have fallen apart right then. I could have raged and made threats and tried to force my way back into their lives. But I didn't. I saved that video. I looked at it every single morning for 6 months while I figured out how to survive. And I made myself a promise in a motel room that cost $40 a night that I could barely afford. I promised that someday they would all understand exactly what they'd done, and they would regret it more than anything they'd ever done in their entire lives. First year was survival. I worked 3 jobs including overnight stocking and weekend construction, and I lived in the cheapest rooms I could find and I saved every dollar. I had a felony conviction, so decent jobs weren't easy, but I learned that commercial real estate didn't care much about your record if you could analyze numbers and close deals. I started as an assistant at a small firm that specialized in distressed properties, and I was good at it. Really good. I understood how people ended up underwater on mortgages and which properties were worth saving and which ones were about to collapse. By year 2, I was handling my own accounts. By year 3, I'd moved to a bigger firm. By year 4, I was managing a team. And the whole time I was watching Frank and Simone's cleaning company because small business records are public if you know where to look, and I made it my business to know everything about their finances. They'd expanded. Roy was officially a partner. They'd taken out a substantial loan secured against their commercial property where they ran operations and stored equipment. Frank had also personally guaranteed the loan, using the house as additional collateral, because apparently Roy had convinced him they needed to go big or go home. The business did okay for a while, but then the pandemic hit and they lost clients and the loan payments got harder to manage. Year 5, I joined the acquisitions department at my current firm. We buy distressed commercial properties and underperforming business loans from banks that want them off their books. We're good at it. I'm especially good at it. And when the file came across my desk 6 months ago, showing that Frank and Simone's business loan had been sold by their original bank to a larger institution that was looking to offload risky small business debt, I made sure my firm bought that portfolio. Not just their loan, the whole portfolio, 20 properties. But theirs was the one I wanted. I've spent 6 months reviewing every payment, every covenant, every clause in that loan agreement. They're 3 months behind on payments. Roy apparently made some bad decisions about equipment purchases and tried to expand too fast, and now they're bleeding money. The loan I now control is about to mature, and they need to either pay it off, refinance, or lose everything. They can't refinance. Their credit is shot and no bank will touch them. They can't pay it off because they don't have the cash, which means foreclosure on the commercial property and on their house because Frank was dumb enough to guarantee the whole thing personally. Last week, I sent the standard foreclosure notice. 60 days to cure the default, or we proceed with seizure of assets. It went to their business address and to their home. Very official, very legal, just business. Yesterday, my assistant told me there were people in the lobby asking to see me. No appointment. She said they seemed upset and insisted it was urgent. I told her to send them away, but she said they weren't leaving, and one of them was crying and claiming to be my mother. I looked at the security camera feed from the lobby on my computer. Frank and Simone and Roy, standing there looking smaller and older and desperate. Simone was actually crying, and Frank kept running his hands through his hair, and Roy looked like he was about to throw up. I told my assistant to tell them I was in meetings all day. They didn't leave. They stayed in the lobby for 4 hours. When I left that evening through the executive exit, they were still there, and I could see Simone sitting on the floor with her head in her hands, and Frank pacing, and Roy on his phone probably calling anyone he could think of who might help them. This morning, they were back. Earlier this time, Simone was holding a photograph. I zoomed in on the security feed, and it was a picture of me from high school. She was showing it to my assistant and saying, "Please just let me talk to my son. Please, this is an emergency. We're going to lose everything." My assistant asked if I wanted her to call security. I said no. I said, let them wait. They've been in my lobby for 6 hours now. Frank keeps trying to get my assistant to give me messages. Simone keeps crying. Roy is sitting in a chair staring at the floor, and I'm in my office behind my brushed steel nameplate watching them on the security monitor and remembering that video Haley sent me. Remembering Simone screaming at mall security that I was a monster. Remembering Frank testifying in court that I was violent and dangerous. Remembering 7 months in county jail. Remembering begging for my belongings back and being told they donated everything. Remembering that I had to build my entire life from absolute zero while they toasted Roy becoming their real son. They want mercy now. They want their son back now. They want me to save them now. They're about to find out exactly what monster really means. Update 1. Alright, so, based on the comments telling me to actually face them, and the ones saying I should make them squirm first, you'll be happy to know I did both. Day 3 of them camping out in my lobby. I finally told my assistant to let them up. But here's the thing. I made them wait until end of day. Made them sit there from 9 a.m. until 5:30 p.m., watching every other person get to go about their business while they just waited to see if their son would give them 5 minutes. When my assistant finally brought them to my office, Frank looked like he'd aged 10 years. Simone's makeup was smeared from crying and her hands were shaking. Roy walked in last and he wouldn't make eye contact with me at all, which was interesting because 6 years ago, he looked right at me while he lied to the cops about me attacking him. I didn't stand up when they came in, didn't offer them chairs even though there are 4 in front of my desk. Just looked at them and waited. Frank started talking first about how they'd been trying to reach me and how this was all a misunderstanding and they just needed to explain the situation with the loan. I let him talk for maybe 2 minutes before I held up my hand and he actually stopped mid-sentence like I had some kind of authority over him now. Guess that's what happens when you control someone's entire financial future. I asked them why they thought I'd help them. Simone started crying harder and said, because you're our son, and family helps family. And we made mistakes, but we've always loved you. I looked right at her and said you stood in court and said I wasn't your son anymore, so which is it? She didn't have an answer for that. Just kept crying. Roy tried next. He said, Connor, man, I know things got out of hand back then, but we were all young and stupid, and your parents are good people who are about to lose everything over some bad business decisions. I asked him if my bedroom was comfortable. He stopped talking. I asked him if he enjoyed driving my car for 2 years before he finally sold it. I asked him how it felt to become the real son while I was in county jail eating garbage food and sharing a cell with guys who'd actually committed real crimes. Frank jumped in and said that's what they needed to talk to me about because there was context I didn't understand. I leaned back in my chair and said, okay, Frank, you have 10 minutes to give me context for why you testified in court that I was violent and dangerous. 10 minutes to explain why you changed the locks and donated all my belongings. 10 minutes to make me understand why you told me Roy was your real son now. Here's what came out, and honestly, I wish I could say I was surprised, but I wasn't. Frank and Simone had always wanted a son who would take over their business. That was supposed to be me, except I made it clear I didn't want that life. I wanted something different. Every time I talked about leaving or doing my own thing, Simone would get upset and Frank would make comments about how I was ungrateful and didn't appreciate what they'd built. When Roy moved to town and started working for them, he was everything they wanted. Enthusiastic about the business, full of ideas, respectful and compliant. Frank said Roy came to him about 8 months after moving in and said he was worried about me. Said I'd been talking about how the family business was beneath me and how I thought I was better than them. Said I'd told Roy that Frank and Simone were holding me back and I couldn't wait to get away from them. Now here's the thing, I never said any of that to Roy. We barely talked. But Roy was smart. He knew exactly what my parents wanted to hear, and he fed it to them bit by bit until they actually believed their own son looked down on them and resented them. Simone admitted this in my office. She said Roy would come to her concerned and caring and tell her about things I'd supposedly said, and she wanted to believe it wasn't true, but then she'd see me working my warehouse job and talking about moving out, and it all seemed to fit. Frank said the mall incident was supposed to be a wake-up call. Roy had convinced them that I needed to hit rock bottom before I'd appreciate what I had. The plan was I'd get arrested, spend a night in jail maybe, learn my lesson, and come home ready to commit to the family. Except I didn't come home repentant. I maintained I'd been set up, which Frank said proved I wasn't taking responsibility for my actions. So they doubled down. The loan thing, though, that wasn't part of any plan. That was just Roy being an idiot businessman and Frank trusting him. Roy had convinced them to expand aggressively right before the pandemic hit, and now they were drowning in debt and equipment payments and a loan they couldn't service. The bank had sold the loan 6 months ago, and they'd been scrambling to figure out who bought it so they could negotiate. When they got the foreclosure notice with my firm's name on it, Simone said she thought it was a coincidence at first. Then she looked up the company online and saw my name on the acquisitions team page, and she knew. Frank said they'd tried to call me, but I'd changed my number years ago, obviously. They tried to email, but I have assistants who screen everything. So they came to my office because what else could they do? Roy finally spoke up again and said, "Look, Connor, we screwed up okay, but you've clearly done well for yourself and you don't need to destroy us to prove a point." I asked him what point he thought I was proving. He said revenge or whatever. But this is bigger than what happened 6 years ago because it's not just about Frank and Simone anymore. It's about their employees and the people who depend on them. I told Roy that I'd depended on my parents and they threw me away the second he convinced them to. I asked him if he'd given any thought to the employees of my life when he was sleeping in my bed and spending my money. He said that wasn't fair, and I said neither was 7 months in jail for a fight you started. Frank tried to get things back on track and asked what it would take for me to extend the loan or work out a payment plan. I told him the loan was a business asset my firm owned, and I couldn't just give special treatment to anyone, even if they claimed to be my parents. Simone started begging, actually begging, saying, "Please, Connor, we'll do anything, we made terrible mistakes, but please don't take our home." That's when Haley walked in. My assistant tried to stop her, but Haley just pushed past and came into my office like she owned the place. She's 23 now and looks exactly like Simone used to look before the stress aged her. She saw our parents and Roy and said, "Oh good, you're all here." And then she looked at me and said, "We need to talk about this like adults, Connor, because what you're doing is cruel." I asked Haley if she remembered the video she sent me, the one of them toasting my sentencing. She had the nerve to say that was taken out of context and they were just trying to make the best of a bad situation. I asked her what context made celebrating your brother going to jail acceptable. She said I wasn't acting like her brother back then, I was acting like a stranger and they were scared of me. This is where it got really interesting. Haley said she'd recently gotten engaged and her fiance's family was helping them buy a house and she didn't want our family drama ruining that for her. She said if I foreclosed on Frank and Simone and made them homeless, it would reflect badly on her. She'd already told her future in-laws that we were a close family with no issues. I started laughing. I couldn't help it. Haley looked offended and asked what was funny. And I said, "You're worried about looking bad to your fiance's family? While our parents are about to be homeless because of decisions they made, and you want me to fix it so you don't have to explain that your family is dysfunctional." She said it wasn't like that, and I said, "Then what's it like, Haley?" She pulled out her phone and showed me texts. Apparently, Frank and Simone had been texting her all week about how I was refusing to meet with them and how she needed to convince me because I'd always listened to her when we were kids. The texts were wild. Simone literally wrote, "If Connor won't help us, we'll have to move in with you." And Haley had responded, "No, absolutely. Not there's no room." So Haley wasn't here out of family loyalty. She was here because she didn't want our broke parents moving into her space. Frank started getting angry then. He said I was being unreasonable and vindictive, and if I'd just been honest 6 years ago about not wanting to be part of the family, instead of acting out violently, none of this would have happened. I reminded him that Roy started the fight, and I'd been defending myself, and Frank said I'd always made excuses instead of taking responsibility. Roy said maybe we should all take a breath and talk about solutions, and I told him to get out of my office. He looked shocked and said, "What?" And I said, "Get out. I don't do business with people who frame their family members for assault." He started to argue, and I picked up my desk phone and told my assistant to call building security. Roy left, just walked out. That's when Simone completely fell apart. She said, "You've become so cold and this isn't the son I raised, and I used to know you had a good heart." I told her she didn't raise me into who I am now. County jail and sleeping in $20 motels and working 3 jobs raised me into this. She created the version of me that was convenient for her. And when that version didn't do what she wanted, she got rid of him and made Roy into her son instead. Frank asked how much money I want. Just straight up asked what my price was to make this go away. I told him there was no price, because this wasn't about money. He said everything's about money. Connor, name your number. I said the number is 60 days until foreclosure proceeds, and at that point they'll have to vacate both the commercial property and the house, and hope they can find somewhere to rent with their destroyed credit. Haley called me heartless, said she couldn't believe I'd turned into this person. I asked her if she'd felt heartless filming that video of them toasting my sentencing, and she said she was barely 18 then and didn't know better. I said I was 19 when they sent me to jail, and I had to figure out pretty fast how the world actually works. They left about 20 minutes later after Frank made some threats about getting a lawyer to fight the foreclosure, and Simone kept crying and saying this wasn't over. Haley told me she'd never forgive me if I went through with this, and I told her she'd been added to the list of people I don't care about anymore. But here's where it gets complicated. After they left, I looked up Haley's fiancé because I was curious. Turns out his family owns a mid-sized construction firm that's actually on my radar for a completely different acquisition my firm is considering. They're not in trouble, but they've got some interesting contract disputes that could be leveraged if needed. And Roy. I did some more digging into what he's been up to. He's not just Frank's business partner anymore. He got married last year and his wife is pregnant. They live in a rental property about 15 minutes from Frank and Simone's house. Want to guess who owns that rental property? The same portfolio company my firm just acquired along with Frank's business loan. Roy's lease is up in 2 months, and guess who gets to decide if it renews? This isn't just about making them understand what they did anymore. This is about showing them that every single decision they made to protect Roy and exclude me is about to cost them everything they've built in the 6 years since they threw me away. Tomorrow, I'm meeting with my legal team about the foreclosure timeline and about the rental property situation. Frank and Simone think they have 60 days to figure something out, but that clock is about to get much more complicated. Update 2. So the comments asking if I'm actually going through with it. Yeah, I am. And it's gotten way messier than even I expected. Also to the person who said I should check if Roy's wife knows what he did 6 years ago. That suggestion turned out to be extremely relevant in ways I didn't anticipate. Week after the office meeting, my legal team confirmed the foreclosure timeline is solid. 60 days from notice, which puts us at mid-January for the commercial property and the house. But here's what I found out that made things interesting. The commercial property has 8 employees who've been with Frank and Simone for years. These aren't just random workers. They're people who rely on that business for their livelihoods and health insurance and all that. Frank apparently spent the last week telling all 8 of them that his son is vindictively destroying the family business over a personal grudge. He painted me as this rich corporate type who forgot where he came from and is taking revenge by putting innocent people out of work. 2 of the employees are related to people in my extended family, and word spread fast. My aunt on Simone's side called me. She's in her 60s, and I hadn't spoken to her since before the arrest. She told me she'd heard about the situation and wanted to understand my side before judging, but that Frank and Simone were telling everyone I'd become this heartless person who was punishing them for trying to teach me responsibility 6 years ago. I asked her what she remembered about my arrest, and she admitted she'd only heard Frank and Simone's version, which was that I'd attacked Roy unprovoked. I told her everything. The setup at the mall, the testimony in court, the changed locks, the donated belongings, all of it. She went quiet for a long time, and then said she'd always thought something felt wrong about that situation, but Frank and Simone had been so convincing and so upset that she'd believed them. She asked if there was any way to resolve this without destroying them, and I told her they had 60 days to figure something out, but I wasn't giving them special treatment. She said she understood but asked me to consider the employees, and I told her those employees chose to believe Frank's story about me being vindictive without ever asking for my side, so they could deal with the consequences of working for people who make terrible business decisions. Then Roy's wife, Lauren, showed up at my office. She's about 7 months pregnant, and she looked exhausted. My assistant tried to turn her away, but Lauren said she'd wait as long as it took and she wasn't leaving until I talked to her. I was curious, so I let her come up. Lauren sat down and immediately said she didn't know what happened 6 years ago. She'd met Roy 3 years ago, and he'd told her he had a cousin who'd had some legal trouble and the family had tried to help, but I'd cut everyone off. That was it. No details about the mall. No details about him moving into my room or taking my car. Just a vague story about troubled family dynamics. I asked her why she was there, and she said because Roy came home from my office that day and told her we were about to lose our apartment and possibly everything else because his business partner's son was foreclosing on properties they controlled. She'd asked why, and Roy had said it was complicated family stuff from years ago. When she pressed him, he admitted he'd been involved in an incident that led to me going to jail, but that it had been blown out of proportion. So I told her the real story. Every detail. The setup, the testimony, moving into my room, taking my car, becoming the real son. Lauren sat there, and I watched her face change as she realized her husband had lied to her about fundamental things. She asked if I had any proof, and I showed her the video Haley had sent me, the one of them toasting my sentencing with Roy right there, arm around Simone. Lauren started crying. Not dramatic crying, just quiet tears running down her face. She said she'd asked Roy multiple times about his relationship with Frank and Simone and why they treated him like a son, and he'd always said they were just really close and family-oriented. She'd thought it was sweet. Now she was realizing her husband had essentially stolen another man's family and life while that man was in jail. She asked what I wanted from her, and I said nothing. I'm not in the business of punishing pregnant women for their husbands' choices. She said Roy told her I was refusing to work with Frank and Simone out of spite, and I corrected her that I was treating them exactly like I'd treat any other borrower who defaulted on a loan. Business isn't personal even when it started personal. Lauren asked if there was any way to extend the foreclosure timeline, and I told her that wasn't my decision alone to make. And even if it was, why would I? She said because we have a baby coming, and nowhere to go if we lose the apartment. I reminded her that Roy's lease situation was separate from Frank and Simone's loan situation, and she'd need to talk to the property management division, not me. She left about 30 minutes later, and I figured that was the end of it, but apparently, she went straight to Frank and Simone's house and confronted Roy in front of them. This I know because Simone called me from Frank's phone that night and left this long, rambling voicemail about how I'd manipulated Roy's wife and turned her against him and caused problems in their marriage, and was I happy now that I'd hurt an innocent pregnant woman. I didn't call back. But the next day, Roy showed up at my office again, without Frank or Simone this time. He looked like he hadn't slept, and he asked if we could talk privately. I let him in, and he shut the door and said Lauren had given him an ultimatum. Either he comes clean about everything that happened 6 years ago to Frank and Simone and takes full responsibility, or she's leaving him and moving back to her parents' house in another state. Roy said he couldn't tell Frank and Simone the truth because they'd hate him and he'd lose everything he'd built with them over the last 6 years. I asked him why that was my problem, and he said because if I backed off the foreclosure and extended his lease, then he'd tell Lauren whatever she needed to hear to stay, and we could all move forward. I actually laughed at that. I asked Roy if he seriously thought I'd give up my leverage to help him save his marriage to a woman he'd been lying to for 3 years. He said he wasn't asking me to give it up, just to pause it and give them time to figure things out financially. I asked how much time, and he said maybe 6 months. I told Roy that in 6 months the property values would shift and my firm would lose money on the delay, and that wasn't happening. He started getting desperate then and said, "What do you want? Connor, just tell me what you want." I said I wanted him to experience what I experienced 6 years ago, but worse, because he deserved worse. He asked what that meant, and I laid it out for him. I wanted him to lose his home. I wanted him to lose his job. I wanted Frank and Simone to know exactly what he'd done and watch him lose their trust and support. I wanted his wife to know the kind of man she'd married, and I wanted him to have to build a life from nothing while knowing that the family he'd stolen from me would never take him back. Roy said I was insane, and I'd gone too far, and he'd fight this legally if he had to. I told him to get a lawyer then. And good luck finding one who'd work for someone about to be evicted with no money. He left swearing and slamming my office door. 2 days after that, Haley showed up again, but this time she brought her fiancé, Marcus. Marcus is 30 and works in his family's construction business doing project management. He seemed uncomfortable being there and kept looking at Haley like he wasn't sure why she'd dragged him into this. Haley launched into this speech about how she'd told Marcus everything about our family situation and he'd agreed to help mediate because he's good at conflict resolution. Marcus looked even more uncomfortable and said he'd actually just offered to listen and maybe provide perspective, but wasn't sure he should be involved. I asked Marcus what Haley had told him, and he said she'd explained that her brother was foreclosing on their parents' business over a dispute from years ago, and that the family was trying to reconcile, but I was being stubborn. I asked him if Haley had mentioned that her parents had testified against me in court and sent me to jail. Marcus looked at Haley and said, "No, you said it was a fight that got out of hand." Haley tried to redirect and said the details weren't important. What mattered was finding a solution now. I asked Marcus if his family knew about any of this, and he admitted they didn't, because Haley had asked him not to tell them since it might affect how they viewed her family. I said that was interesting because lying to your future in-laws about your family being functional seems like a bad way to start a marriage. Marcus asked what really happened 6 years ago, and I told him everything, while Haley tried to interrupt and say I was making it sound worse than it was. When I got to the part about the video she'd sent me, Marcus turned to her and asked if that was true. She said it was just a dumb thing they did when emotions were high and she was 18 and didn't know better. Marcus asked to see the video. Haley said no, but I pulled it up on my phone and showed him. Watching him watch that video was satisfying in ways I can't describe. He saw Frank toasting new beginnings and Simone laughing and Roy with his arm around her and Haley filming it all and sending it to me with that caption about them doing great without me. Marcus stood up and told Haley they needed to leave. She tried to argue, but he was already walking toward the door. She followed him out and I could hear them arguing in the hallway about why she'd minimized what happened and why she'd lied about the details. That was 4 days ago. Since then, Frank has been calling my office repeatedly demanding I meet with him again. Simone sent me a Facebook friend request, which I ignored. Roy's been posting on social media about family loyalty and forgiveness, which is rich coming from him, and Haley left me a voicemail saying Marcus is reconsidering the engagement because I showed him that video and made her look bad. Yesterday, my assistant told me there were people in the lobby again, but this time it wasn't Frank and Simone. It was 3 of the employees from their business. They wanted to talk about the foreclosure and how it would affect them. I agreed to meet with them because they hadn't done anything to me personally, even if they'd believed Frank's version of events. The employees asked if there was any way to save the business separately from Frank and Simone. They said they'd been discussing pooling resources to maybe buy out the business assets if Frank and Simone lost ownership. I told them that was between them and Frank and Simone, but that my firm would be seizing the commercial property as collateral, which included the equipment and client contracts. One of them asked why I was doing this, and I asked if Frank had told them what he'd done to me. They admitted he'd mentioned a falling out, but said families fight all the time, and this seemed extreme. I gave them the short version and watched their faces change as they realized their boss had sent his own son to jail to protect his nephew. They left saying they needed to think about their options. Within hours, Frank called me screaming about how I was poisoning his employees against him and trying to destroy not just his business, but his reputation. I let him yell for about 90 seconds, then hung up. The foreclosure date is now 42 days away. Roy's lease termination is 58 days away. Haley's engagement is apparently hanging by a thread. Frank and Simone's employees are questioning everything they thought they knew about their employers. And Lauren is staying with her parents trying to decide if she's coming back to Roy at all. Every single one of them is scrambling and desperate and turning on each other, trying to figure out who can save them. And I'm sitting in my office watching it all fall apart exactly the way I spent 6 years planning it would. But Frank isn't done yet. He filed something with his attorney. My legal team just notified me that he's attempting to challenge the foreclosure on grounds that I have a conflict of interest and shouldn't be allowed to handle this case given our relationship. It won't work, but it'll slow things down by maybe 2 weeks while it gets dismissed. 2 weeks they're going to use to try every possible angle to either change my mind or find alternative financing. This isn't over yet, and Frank's clearly decided to go down fighting rather than accepting what's coming. Final update. Alright, so this is probably going to be my last update because everything that needed to happen has happened. And honestly, I'm done talking about these people. To everyone who said I should see this through to the end, I did. And you're about to find out exactly how it all played out. Frank's legal challenge got dismissed in 9 days instead of 2 weeks. The judge took one look at the case and said a family relationship doesn't constitute conflict of interest in a standard commercial foreclosure, and that my firm had acquired the loan through legitimate channels before I knew which borrowers were in the portfolio. Frank's attorney apparently told him he'd wasted money on a motion that had 0 chance of success, but Frank had insisted. During those 9 days, though, Frank and Simone tried everything. They reached out to every family member they could think of to pressure me. My aunt called again, asking if I'd reconsider for the sake of family unity. I told her that ship sailed 6 years ago when they changed the locks. 2 cousins I barely knew sent me messages on social media about forgiveness and moving forward. I didn't respond. Simone created a whole new Facebook account to message me after I'd ignored her friend request. She sent me paragraphs about how she'd been a good mother, who made mistakes under stress and how Roy had manipulated them, and they were victims too. I read every word and then blocked that account too. She made another one. I blocked that one. She tried Instagram. Blocked. She was relentless in a way she'd never been when I actually needed a mother. Roy tried a different approach. He went to my boss, actually went to the managing director of my firm, and requested a meeting to discuss ethical concerns about my handling of his family's case. My boss called me into his office and asked what was going on, and I laid out the whole situation, including the arrest and the setup and the 6 years of planning. My boss listened and then said as long as I'd followed proper procedures in acquiring and managing the asset, there was no issue, and that family drama wasn't grounds for recusal. Roy apparently didn't take that well because he tried going to the state licensing board next, claiming I was abusing my position for personal vendetry. That complaint is still pending, but my firm's legal team says it's baseless and will be dismissed. Roy's burning through what little money he has left on legal fees trying to find any angle that works. The actual foreclosure date hit on a Tuesday in mid-January. The commercial property seizure happened first. Frank and Simone had to clear out by 5 p.m. and turn over all keys and access codes. I wasn't there personally, but my property manager sent me updates throughout the day. Frank apparently spent 3 hours trying to convince the manager to give them an extension. The manager explained multiple times that the property now belonged to my firm and they were trespassing if they didn't leave. The 8 employees had already been notified their employment was terminated as of that day. 4 of them had found other jobs. The other 4 were scrambling. Frank had told them all that this was temporary and he'd get the business back, but none of them believed him anymore. One employee apparently confronted Frank in the parking lot and said he'd talked to me and knew the real story about what Frank had done to his son and that Frank had been lying to all of them for years. Frank tried to physically stop the property manager from changing the locks. The manager had to call the police. Frank got a warning for interfering with lawful business operations. Simone sat in their van crying the entire time. Roy wasn't there at all because he was dealing with his own situation. Roy's lease termination happened 3 days later on a Friday. Lauren had come back from her parents' house, but only to help Roy pack because she'd decided to file for separation. She was 7 months pregnant and packing boxes while Roy tried to convince her to stay. My property manager for the residential side told me Roy had begged for a month-to-month extension and offered to pay double rent, but the answer was no. Roy and Lauren moved into a weekly rate motel, the kind that rents to people who have nowhere else to go. I know this because Haley posted about it on social media, talking about how cruel it was that her cousin and his pregnant wife were living in a motel, while her brother sat in his expensive office doing nothing. Marcus had apparently broken off their engagement by that point, and Haley was spiraling, trying to get sympathy online. Several people who knew the real story commented on her post, explaining what Frank and Simone had actually done to me. Haley deleted the post and made her account private, but the damage was done. Her friends knew. Marcus's family definitely knew by then. She'd gone from planning a wedding to being single and associated with parents who destroyed their own son's life. The house foreclosure was the big one. That happened on a Monday morning 3 weeks after the business property. Frank and Simone had 24 hours to remove personal belongings and vacate. They'd been living there for 18 years. It was the house I'd grown up in and the house they'd locked me out of when I got released from jail. This time I went. I wanted to see it. I parked across the street and watched the moving truck they'd rented pull up. It was a small truck because they couldn't afford a big one, and most of their furniture wasn't worth moving anyway. They'd already sold what they could to try to make loan payments that were never going to be enough. Frank saw me sitting in my car. He walked across the street and stood next to my window. I rolled it down and he just stared at me for a long moment. Then he said, "You got what you wanted. I hope you're happy." I told him I'd spent 6 years waiting for this exact moment, and yes, I was happy. He said, "We're your parents, Connor. No matter what happened, you're still our son, and this is cruel." I reminded him that he'd stood in court and said I was dangerous and violent, and that Simone had screamed at security guards that I was a monster. I asked him if he remembered changing the locks. He said they'd been scared and confused, and Roy had convinced them I was a threat. I asked Frank when he'd stopped being scared. When had he realized maybe they'd made a mistake? He admitted it was about 2 years after I left when Roy started making bad business decisions, and Frank realized Roy wasn't the son he'd thought he was. But by then, they didn't know how to reach me, and they were embarrassed about what they'd done. So they'd known for 4 years that they'd destroyed their son's life over lies. And they'd done nothing about it except hope I never came back. Frank said they'd talked about trying to find me, but they didn't know what they'd say. I told him they could have said they were sorry, but that would have required admitting they'd been wrong. and Frank never admitted he was wrong about anything. Simone came over then. She looked old, like she'd aged 15 years in the last 2 months. She asked if I was there to gloat, and I said no, I was there to make sure they actually left. She said this was still her home, and I couldn't just take it. And I reminded her that Frank had used it as collateral on a loan he couldn't pay. So yes, I absolutely could take it. She started crying again and said, "Where are we supposed to go?" And I suggested the motel where Roy was staying since they'd been so eager to make him their real son. Frank told me I'd become exactly what Simone had called me that night at the mall. And I said good, because monsters don't get walked over by their own families. Roy pulled up in a beaten 2008 Honda Accord he'd apparently bought for $800 after selling whatever he had left. He got out and told Frank and Simone to get away from me before I caused more problems. I asked Roy how the motel was, and he told me to shut up. Frank told Roy this wasn't the time, but Roy ignored him and came right up to my car window. Roy said, "You've destroyed everything, Connor. Are you satisfied now because you've hurt more than just us? You've hurt Lauren and our baby and Haley and employees who never did anything to you." I told Roy that 6 years ago I'd hurt nobody, and his response had been to frame me for assault and steal my entire life. So yeah, I was satisfied watching his life fall apart the same way. He said I'd had choices and could have been the bigger person and moved on. And I asked him what moving on looked like when you've lost 6 months to jail and had to start from zero with a criminal record. Roy said plenty of people overcome worse, and I said yeah, they do. And I overcame it by spending 6 years positioning myself to destroy everyone who'd betrayed me. Simone tried to get between us and told Roy to stop antagonizing me because I clearly couldn't be reasoned with. Roy said someone needed to make Connor understand he'd gone too far, and Frank said it was over anyway. And they needed to focus on packing. They went back to the house and spent the next 5 hours loading the truck. I sat there the entire time. Every box they carried out, every piece of furniture they struggled with, every trip back and forth to the truck, I watched all of it. Simone kept glancing over at me like she couldn't believe I was actually staying. Frank pretended I wasn't there. Roy came back twice to help, and both times he looked at me with this expression that was part hatred and part disbelief, like he couldn't understand how the kid he'd set up 6 years ago had ended up with this much power over his life. When they finally finished and the truck pulled away, I got out of my car and walked up to the house. The front door was still open. I went inside and stood in the living room where I'd spent 19 years of my life. It was empty now except for some garbage they'd left behind. I went down to the basement where my bedroom had been, the room Roy had taken over. It was stripped bare. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, just remembering what it felt like to live in that house and be treated like I was in the way. Remembering Frank's comments about me thinking I was too good for the family business. Remembering Simone's sighs whenever I talked about my plans. Remembering Roy sitting at the dinner table charming them while I ate in silence. Then, I locked up and left. My firm is listing the property next week. We'll sell it and recoup our losses on Frank's defaulted loan. Whatever's left over after fees and back interest will go to Frank and Simone, but that won't be much. Maybe a few $1,000s, not enough for a security deposit on an apartment in this city. Last I heard, Frank and Simone moved in with Simone's sister 2 hours away. The sister wasn't happy about it, but family is family, apparently. Except when it's your own son asking for help, then family doesn't matter at all. They're sleeping in a guest room and looking for jobs in their 60s with bad credit and no business. Roy and Lauren are still at the motel. Lauren's due in about 6 weeks, and she's filed for full custody and child support. Roy's working at a warehouse, making $12 an hour, which is exactly what I was making 6 years ago when this all started. He's got a criminal record now, too, because he fell behind on his car insurance and got pulled over driving without it, and they found out he had unpaid tickets from years ago. Haley's working retail and living with roommates. Her social media is still private, but people I know who follow her say she posts a lot about toxic family members and moving on from negativity. She hasn't tried to contact me since Marcus broke up with her. As for me, I'm doing exactly what I plan to do. My career is solid. My firm is talking about promoting me to senior acquisitions manager. I've got a nice apartment and a car I actually own, and a life I built entirely by myself without anyone's help because I couldn't rely on the people who were supposed to support me. Do I feel bad about any of this? No, not even a little bit. They had 6 years to try to make things right, and they didn't because they were comfortable with the family they'd built without me. They only cared when their comfort was threatened, and they needed me to save them. To the people commenting that I should have been the bigger person, I was the bigger person for 6 years while I rebuilt my life from nothing. Being the bigger person doesn't mean letting people destroy you and then welcoming them back when they need something. To the people saying family is family, and I should have helped them, they stopped being my family the second they threw me in jail to protect Roy. Family doesn't do what they did. Family doesn't lock you out. Family doesn't toast your imprisonment. They made their choice 6 years ago, and now they're living with it. 6 years ago, I stood outside their house with $200 and told myself they'd all drown in this betrayal someday. Turns out I was right. They're drowning, and I'm the one who controls whether they get a life raft, and I'm choosing to watch them sink. That promise I made to myself in that motel room about making them understand what they'd done? Promise kept. They understand now. Every single one of them knows exactly what it costs to throw away someone who loved them and needed them. And I'm done. I'm done thinking about them. I'm done planning revenge. I'm done letting them take up space in my head. The foreclosures are complete. The properties are seized. The family is scattered. Justice has been served in the only way that actually matters, which is making them experience the same loss and helplessness and abandonment they put me through. They wanted Roy to be their real son. Now they've got nobody, and Roy's got nothing, and Haley's alone, and I've got everything I built without any of them. 6 years ago, they threw me out and said never return. I never did. And now they know that was the biggest mistake they ever made.